November 29, 1944. On November 29, 1944, a lone American submarine stalked a shadow through the Black Pacific. Commander Joseph Enright of the USS Archerfish had chased the mystery contact all night, and at dawn, he fired 6 torpedoes. 4 hit home. The target was the Shinano, a secret supercarrier of nearly 70,000 tons, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, just 10 days out of the shipyard, and she died in 5 hours. Japan did not lose the Pacific War at Midway. She lost it silently, ton by ton, and her supply line was already cut. The Broken Spear. In 1941, the Empire of Japan looked unbeatable by any quiet means. She had swept across Asia and the islands like a tide, and the oceans around her bristled with her conquests. She fought with oil she did not own, steel she did not mine, and rubber and tin she had taken at gunpoint from half the world's map. Her lifeline ran across the sea, and everyone knew it. Everyone also knew that cutting it would take a weapon that could live under that sea, unseen, and strike without warning. America had that weapon. She had the submarines. She had the boats, the bases, the men, and she had a torpedo that betrayed every one of them. The Mark 14 torpedo was the sharpest spear in the American arsenal. On paper, in the water, it was a fraud with a warhead. 4 separate flaws were documented in the early war years. The torpedo ran deeper than it was set, passing beneath hulls it should have struck. The magnetic exploder fired early, or not at all. The contact exploder, the pin meant to detonate on impact, proved so weak that good hits struck and did nothing. Solid steel meeting a hull, and then silence. And on the worst nights, a torpedo ran in a circle and came back at the boat that had fired it. Think about what that meant. A submarine captain risked his boat, his crew, his life to get into position, crept through minefields, dodged destroyers, held his breath while the enemy sailed past, and fired his one chance at a merchantman. The torpedo ran under. The torpedo dudded. The torpedo exploded 10 yards too soon. The perfect approach ended, again and again, in nothing but the sound of a useless splash. The officers who watched their best shots die complained for a year and a half. The Navy's Ordnance Bureau dismissed their reports as excuses, as bad shooting, as the fumbling of men who had never used a proper weapon, and the boats kept going out with a spear that would not bite. Then a man named Charles Lockwood took command of the Pacific Submarine Force, and he did what the bureaucrats would not. He tested the torpedo himself. He ordered the magnetic exploder deactivated in July of 1943, and the fleet began to use a simpler, crueler weapon, a contact exploder that detonated when it hit, and only when it hit. The spear finally had its point. But a sharp blade still needs hands to swing it, and the hands America gave that blade were fewer and more precious than anyone in the war room guessed. The few. Every man who went to sea on an American submarine in the Pacific was a volunteer. Everyone. The cooks, the electricians, the torpedomen, the officers. The Navy did not draft submariners. It asked for them, and it took only the best it was offered. The submarine service was a sliver of the fleet. Less than 2% of the Navy's personnel served beneath the sea in the Pacific, a fraction no one would have bet on in 1942. And yet these were the men who would do the arithmetic of the war, not in offices, but in 90-degree heat, in shared bunks, in air that tasted of diesel and fear, at periscope depth, under the pounding of depth charges, while the ocean tried to crush their steel around them. They were chosen, tested, and trusted with the most dangerous duty the sea offered, and they repaid the trust with a record no other arm of the service could touch. Consider the men of one boat, the USS Tang, commanded by Richard O'Kane. O'Kane had learned the trade as the executive officer of the legendary Wahoo under a captain named Mush Morton, and he carried that schooling into command of his own boat. The Tang patrolled the shipping lanes of the Pacific the way a knife patrols a throat. In her career, she destroyed 33 Japanese ships, totaling 116,454 tons, more tonnage than any American submarine would sink in the entire war, bought with the lives and nerve of one crew of volunteers. But numbers alone did not make the difference. Other navies had brave crews too. What the Americans had, in the end, was a way to use those crews that the enemy could not answer, a doctrine, an arithmetic, and a weapon that finally worked. Because bravery in an empty ocean is only drowning in slow motion. The sharpest crews in the world starve if they never find the enemy. And finding the enemy, knowing exactly where he would be and when, was a problem no amount of courage could solve. It was a problem of arithmetic. The arithmetic Japan had gone to war on a calculation, and the calculation was simple. The empire imported 90% of its oil and 88% of its iron. Think about the shape of that. The home islands had almost nothing under their own soil, no oil to speak of, no iron to speak of, and an empire that cannot import oil, cannot move a ship, fly a plane, or drive a tank. Everything Japan owned on the map was downstream of a single artery, the tanker route that carried the oil of the southern islands up through the South China Sea, past the coasts of China and Formosa, to the refineries and harbors of the home islands. That route was the aorta of the empire. Cut it, and the heart dies. The American submarines did not need to win a single great sea battle to kill that artery. They needed to sink ships, merchant ships, tankers, fat, slow, unarmed vessels full of the black blood of the Japanese war machine. One submarine could not sink an empire in a month, but 100 submarines, working for years, could sink the tonnage faster than the shipyards could replace it. And that was the arithmetic that mattered. Watch the numbers do the work. In August of 1943, Japanese oil imports were running at about 1.75 million barrels a month. By July of 1944, 11 months of submarine warfare, with a working torpedo at last, imports had fallen to 360,000 barrels a month. Not a third, not a half, a fall of nearly 80% in under a year, while the empire's fleets burned the stuff by the tankerful in the battles farther south. The Japanese war economy was not weakening, it was bleeding out through a hole no one could see closing. And still, at the end of 1944, the convoys sailed. The empire knew it was losing tankers. It did not yet believe the loss was mortal. From the oil ports of the south, the great convoys still formed and steamed for home, carrying the last, desperate cargoes of fuel that would decide whether the Japanese fleet could ever move again. Arithmetic means nothing while the convoys still sail. The numbers were a warning. The wolves had not yet delivered the sentence. And in the autumn of 1944, the wolves had learned exactly where to wait. The hunt. The American submarine war had become a science, and the science had 3 instruments. The first was radar. A submarine on the surface at night, with her radar set sweeping, could see the enemy before the enemy saw her, could count a convoy's escorts, read its course, choose her victim, and vanish before the escorts ever knew a hunter was among them. The second was the pack. The Americans, who had begun the war sending out single boats, learned the German trick and made it their own. Wolf packs of submarines, coordinated, waiting in formation across the choke points of the South China Sea, where no convoy could pass unremarked. And the third was patience. The boats did not chase convoys across the ocean. They guessed where the convoys had to be. The narrows, the straits, the deep water lanes between the oil fields and the home islands. And they waited there, on the surface, in the dark, with the radar humming and the torpedoes finally, blessedly, biting. Remember the men of the Tang. Remember O'Kane. That boat was a hammer built for this exact anvil, and the record she set, 33 ships and 116,454 tons, was not luck. It was the new way of war, repeated patrol after patrol, by crew after crew of volunteers until the enemy learned to fear the dark itself. And at the end of 1944 came the strangest trophy of all. Remember the night of November 29, Commander Joseph Enright, in the Archerfish, tailing a shadow he could not identify. He stalked the mystery all night, guessed her course, dove, and fired at dawn. The 4 hits that sank the Shinano, the supercarrier, nearly 70,000 tons, the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, dead in 5 hours, were the loudest proof the war could offer that the silent killers had become the deadliest thing in the Pacific. But here is the hard truth the celebrations missed. The Shinano was a warship, a trophy, a headline, a legend. The war, however, was not decided by warships. It was decided by freighters, by tankers, by the dull, unglamorous tonnage that carried Japan's last oil from the south to the home islands. Seize the biggest warship in the sea, and the empire still breathes. Stop the oil, and it suffocates. The tanker convoys were still sailing, and in the weeks that followed the Shinano's sinking, the submarines turned from the great warships to the work they had been born for. One convoy in particular was already at sea, a convoy built around the last cargoes of the war, and it was carrying something the captains of the Wolfpack could not possibly have guessed. Hit subscribe right now, because what happens next is a massacre and a rescue in the same week. Do not go anywhere. The week. In August of 1944, the great convoy called HI-71 had already felt the teeth of the pack. It sailed in the middle of the month, and on the 18th and 19th of August, in the South China Sea, the American submarines fell on it like weather, savaged it, scattered it, and sent a third of its ships to the bottom. The Empire took the lesson, or tried to. Convoys were tightened, escorts strengthened, routes changed. But there was no route left that was safe. The islands and choke points funneled everything into the same narrow sea, and the packs were waiting there, night after night, radar on, torpedoes ready. On the 6th of September 1944, a new convoy, this one called HI-72, slipped out of Singapore and turned north for home. 9 transports and tankers, the last, heavy cargoes of the Southern Empire, surrounded by their escort. On paper, it was a strong convoy. On paper, the escorts were enough. On the night of the 11th, the radar sets of the American packs found them. At dawn on the 12th of September, the South China Sea came apart. The Wolfpack attacked from every side at once, in the low gray light, when the lookouts were tired and the horizon was all mirrors and shadows. The torpedoes went in among the 9 ships of HI-72 in waves, and the convoy, for all its escorts, could not beat off a pack that had already chosen its victims. The sea around the convoy turned to fire and wreckage. Within the space of hours, 4 of the 9 ships were gone. 4 more limped away burning, damaged beyond use. The supply line of an empire, the very cargoes that were supposed to move the Japanese fleet one last time, slid under the water, exploding, sinking, smothering. And that was when the horror arrived. Because none of the captains knew what their targets were carrying, the Wolfpack had fired at ships, at silhouettes, at radar contacts, and the ships were full. On board some of the transports of HI-72, crowded below decks and in the holds, were more than 2,000 Allied prisoners of war, soldiers and sailors taken in the Empire's victorious years, shipped north in the bowels of the very convoys that carried Japan's last war supplies, alive, forgotten, and now, in the September morning, trapped inside the ships the submarines were sinking. The men who had fired the torpedoes learned it the way the world learns everything terrible, slowly, in fragments, from the debris. The survivors in the water were not only Japanese crewmen, they were prisoners, Australians, Britons, men who had been beaten and starved for years and had come within minutes of being killed by their own rescuers. The victory was poisoned in the same hour it was won. The rescue here is the part of the story that the enemy never expected and the historians never forgot. The submarines did not run. The Pax, having done their work, turned back. And they did something no navy had built them to do. They surfaced among the burning wreckage of HI-72 and began hauling survivors out of the water. Not just their own. Not just the flyers and the sailors they had been sent to save. The rescued men, the Allied prisoners who had floated free of their sinking ships, were hoisted aboard the very submarines that had sunk them. In the days that followed, about 159 Allied prisoners of war were pulled from the sea by the Wolfpack. Sick, naked, starved, shaking. Men who had spent years in the Empire's camps, who had watched their own side lose battle after battle from inside a ship's hold, who had nearly died by their own navy's torpedoes in the last week of their captivity. The killers had come back to become the rescuers, and they hauled those men aboard, wrapped them in blankets, fed them, and carried them home. Think about what that reversal cost. A submarine has no spare berths, no spare food, no spare air. Every prisoner taken aboard meant a longer patrol, a shorter supply, a greater risk in waters where a surfaced hull was a target. The captains did it anyway, because the men in the water were theirs, regardless of which flag they had sailed under. But the rescue could not undo the arithmetic. That is the terrible sentence of the autumn of 1944. Japan's imports had fallen from 1,750,000 barrels a month to 360,000, and the convoys that could have rebuilt them lay burning at the bottom of the South China Sea. The Empire's ships of state were gone before the Empire could admit it. The supply line was not wounded. It was dead. The ledger now. The numbers, because the numbers are the monument. When the war was over, the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, the official accounting of the Pacific, counted what the submarines had done, and the total was almost incomprehensible. The American submarine force had sunk 4,779,902 tons of Japanese merchant shipping. Add to that 540,192 tons of warships. Together, that single arm of one navy, a force of volunteers, a sliver of the fleet, had destroyed 54.6% of everything Japan lost at sea in the entire war. Every half of the enemy's losses. Every other weapon, the carriers, the bombers, the minefields, the surface fleet, together, did less than the submarines did alone. And the merchant capacity? By the end, Japan had lost about 90% of the shipping it had started the war with. 90%. The islands that had once ruled the Pacific had no ships left to carry oil, iron, rice, or men. The tankers were gone. The freighters were gone. The empire was a giant, still standing, already dead of a wound it had felt only as a series of small, annoying losses. A ship here, a tanker there, a convoy in the night that never came home. In Tokyo, the chart still showed a supply line that was already gone. That is the payoff of the promise made at the beginning. Less than 2% of the Navy sank more than half of everything Japan lost at sea and cut its oil imports by 90%. The silent killers did not win a single headline battle that ended the war. They simply made it impossible for Japan to continue to fight one. What it meant: by 1945, the arithmetic had finished its work. Japanese oil imports had fallen to nearly nothing. The great fleet that had once ruled the Pacific sat in its harbors, eating its own reserves, unable to move because there was no fuel to steam on, no fuel to train with, no fuel to fight with. The battleship men and the Admiralty could plan their decisive battle until the maps wore thin. There was no oil to sail it. Japan ran out of fuel before it ran out of ships. So how did the silent killer cut Japan's supply line? Not in 1 week alone, although 1 week in September 1944, the week of HI-72, did the killing that the years had been preparing. The convoy war was a surgery performed at night, for years, by a knife that was sharpened only in 1943, held by a few thousand volunteers, aimed by radar and arithmetic, and driven home in the burning dawns of the South China Sea. The patient, an empire, felt small wounds for a long time, and one morning simply died. The lesson the war left behind is written in every doctrine book since. Logistics is a target. You do not have to win every battle. You only have to cut the line that feeds the enemy's battles. And the most powerful fleet in the world becomes a museum in its own harbors. An empire can lose a war without losing a single battle, once its supply line is cut. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. Like the video if it earned it. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and we will see you in the next one.